Hamas, Israel have reached an impasse in hostage negotiations, Arab mediators tell Wall Street Journal. Report: the Arab mediators said that a hostage Gaza ceasefire deal is unlikely to be completed by the time U.S. President Biden leaves office. Despite new hopes for a deal and renewed talks, Hamas and Israel have hit an impasse, Arab mediators told the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday. The Arab mediators said that a hostage Gaza ceasefire deal is unlikely to be completed by the time United States President Joe Biden leaves office. Hamas reportedly waived the possibility of discussions for a complete end to the war the terror group started until the later stages of a deal, instead focusing on a temporary ceasefire, the release of security prisoners from Israeli prisons, and an increase of aid entering Gaza. The discussions centered around a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza in exchange for the release of 30 hostages, which meet certain conditions, according to the Wall Street Journal. The Arab mediators also claimed Israel had refused to release some of the detainees requested by Hamas. While the mediators did not specify which prisoners Israel had refused to release, reports throughout the war have suggested Hamas desires the release of Fatah leader Marwan Barghouti. Barghouti, former leader of the Tanzim, a militant faction of the Palestinian Fatah movement, was sentenced in 2004 by an Israeli court to 5 cumulative life sentences and 40 years in prison for terrorist acts in which 5 Israelis were murdered and many were injured. On Tuesday, it was reported that Hamas had rejected 12 of the 34 hostages requested for release by Israel. Instead, Hamas reportedly offered the release of 22 living hostages and 12 bodies. Egyptian sources previously reported that Hamas refused 11 of the 34 called for by Israel, considering them to be soldiers, adding to the stagnating hostage discussions. Sources previously told the Jerusalem Post that Hamas had failed to provide a list of living hostages, further complicating discussions. While the Biden administration expressed optimism regarding the future of a hostage deal, the Wall Street Journal report indicates that any prospective deal would come under the presidency of Donald Trump and his pro-Israel administration. Trump has repeatedly warned of hell to pay if Hamas continued to hold the abductees hostage. Reform Party's rise could prompt shift towards proportional representation in UK politics by Gawain Tower, former director of Communications Reform UK. Another honors list. Another blank for Reform.it is silly. It is spiteful. But it might have huge constitutional implications in the coming years. Why? Due to something else that has been revealed in the analysis of the most recent mega poll conducted by think tank More in Common. That poll, which had the Tories gaining 100-plus seats by not changing, and Labour losing over 200 by falling off a cliff, also had Reform gaining over 60 seats. The key here is that under our traditional first-past-the-post (FPTP) system, Reform's votes are worth a fraction of votes for the other main parties. In the general election, a Labour seat required only 23,622 votes. The Lib Dems 48,000, and the Tories won a seat per 56,000 votes cast. However, the Greens required 486,000 votes to win a seat, and Reform, a staggering 823,522 votes to gain a single seat. Practically each Labour vote is worth 30 times one for Reform. This a democratic outrage. However, once Labour was in power, the very idea of making the system fairer is not on the table. Why would it be? The system stacks up so well for them, flattering their success and giving them absolute control over our lives. Reform has long supported the democratically fair idea of proportional representation (PR), as have the Greens and as have the Lib Dems, and it's not hard to see why. But, and a big but, research by Electoral Calculus has shown that if Reform keep their upward trajectory, and there is no good reason to think they won't, a mere 6-point rise in their polling would, under the current first-past-the-post system, make them the largest party, with 200 seats, 3 more. Taking them to where Labour were at the general election would give them an absolute majority. With power, and so much to do, immigration, net zero, the diversity agenda, support for businesses and families through the tax system, it is not hard to imagine that Farage and his team might let PR slide. This is where the upper house comes in. Reform would achieve an historic win. Yes, but they would have nobody in the upper house, because neither the Tories nor Labour would allow it. The defeated legacy parties will now be interested in PR for the first time, as they lose under the brutal arithmetic of FPP. In politics, self-interest always trumps honor. would have the opportunity to hold reform's entire governing program to ransom. Every single piece of legislation would be rejected by the uniparty lords, creating a constitutional nightmare that end such stalemate. Reform might well go to the country again, demanding a confirmation election. There are huge risks in that. Or the legacy parties could strike a deal. Give us PR, and we allow your program to continue. This would mean that no party, and particularly not reform, would ever have an absolute majority again. An outcome far more beneficial to the politically inertia-bound legacy parties than reform with its radical and increasingly popular agenda. 8 fascinating Jewish news stories from 2024 that you might have missed. Jewish stories of the last year have been impossible to miss. Israel at war, anti-Semitism around the world, and a U.S. presidential election featuring Jewish politicians. Others may have slipped under the radar, drowned out by the drumbeat of breaking news. Here, we draw your attention to 8 such stories, starting with one we published at the very beginning of the year, The Magical Life of Albert Levis, a scholar of storytelling who has his own improbable tale. Albert Levis, in his late 80s, is a Holocaust survivor from Greece, a psychiatrist, a real estate investor, a businessman, an author, a student of Jewish philosophy, a possible future documentary star, and a ceaseless searcher of the human condition from his home in Vermont, where his family operates an inn. He has also embarked on a single-minded quest to explain the scientific process by which humanity turns traumatic, morally troubling experiences into stories. He believes it can rid the world of war and strife. If only people would listen. This teenage girl studied the whole Talmud in just 2.5 years. When she was 14, Elka Bentley could hear her father's online Talmud classes through the wall between her bedroom and his home office in Brookline, Massachusetts. Undeterred by the 5 a.m. start time, she tuned in as the men did Daf Yomi, a regimen of page-a-day Talmud learning that stretches over 7.5 years. She decided she wanted to do it faster this year. She pulled it off, completing the entire Babylonian Talmud at 18 before heading off to Harvard University. The rare feat represents something of a landmark for the movement to expand text learning for Orthodox women, the secret list of 29 names that help pollsters find American Jews. How do researchers study American Jews? At least some of the time, they use a list of 29 names that are distinctively Jewish, according to a research protocol that was devised in 1942 and is still used today. The list, which could not be found online until we published it, consists of entirely Ashkenazi surnames, so it would do poorly for identifying, for example, Persian, Israeli, or Russian Jews. A growing concern as American Jewry becomes increasingly diverse. Still, researchers say it has value, and they're updating the list so it stays useful in the future. Jerry Lewis' infamously terrible Holocaust movie is having a moment. You still can't watch it. Film buffs have long understood that legendary funny man Jerry Lewis never wanted anyone to see his Holocaust movie. The Day the Clown Cried, a maudlin tragicomedy about a German clown ordered to entertain children at the Auschwitz death camps, was filmed in the early 1970s, but never completed or released, and it has remained unseen this year. Lewis' folly re-entered the public eye, with a documentary devoted to it, a Hollywood producer acquiring rights to the original script, and the Library of Congress opening its trove of material to researchers. What you need to know about what's widely thought to be the worst Holocaust movie ever made. Klezmer legend Frank London was gearing up for the fight of his life. But first, one more show. That an all-star lineup of Jewish musicians hunkered down at a suburban New York City synagogue one night and made it tackle an intimidating feat. They would be recording 7 new liturgical songs without ever having played together before or even fully working out the music and words. The breakneck pace was not a choice. The lead musician, Klezmer legend Frank London, had been ordered by his oncologist to report to the hospital to start a grueling regimen of treatments meant to cure his rare cancer. The songs have now been released as an album, and London is preparing to retake the stage in early 2025 that a German soldier looted postcards from doomed Jews in Poland. 80 years later, his granddaughter brought them back. As a child, Carla McCabe knew her grandfather had been a German soldier in World War II, but she didn't know what he did during those years. Later, she inherited part of his stamp collection and discovered postcards addressed to a destination destroyed by the Nazis. the famed Chachmai Lublin Yeshiva in Poland this year. McCabe returned the postcards to Lublin, where just 40 Jews live. But an effort is underway to retrieve relics of the lost Jewish house of study. These cards are neither a gift nor a donation, she said in a ceremony we covered from Poland. I am simply bringing home Holocaust loot. Jacob Resse's earliest political activity as a teenager involved campaigning to raise local taxes and denouncing the right-wing commentator and Coulter as spewing hate.